So you got 10 tips for killing giants in your book, starting
Mhm.
with thin ice. What's that?
Thin ice was one of my favorites because every time I interviewed someone new, every time I got one of these entrepreneurs or CEOs, they would quickly say, I love the title. The title is very vivid, killing giants. But I have to be honest, I'm not really trying to kill a giant. I would like to find a way to be left alone. And I think that was really important. Thin ice was all about finding a way to drag the conversation out onto the thin ice of your own making, create an argument where the other guy doesn't want to compete. So, the example I used in the book, one of my favorite interviews was with Robin Li, the founder and CEO of Baidu in China, where he was able to compete very effectively against Google China by saying, we speak Chinese better than those American brands do. Now, was that necessarily true? We could
Mhm.
get into the finer points of that. I gave a keynote once to a group of Silicon Valley executives about this book when it first came out. And in the audience was a guy who was with Google China at the time, Chinese national. And he raised his hand at the end and he said, look, I got a headache with you talking about this because it's exactly what happened. Our engineers were very talented, but we couldn't fight this fight. We're Google China, and they're Baidu. And yeah, so it sounded like that. So this whole idea is yes, you can find a place where you can win. It's the essence of guerrilla marketing, the essence of guerrilla warfare. So, one of my favorite chapters in the book.
Yeah, so today, of course, Baidu's, further, Baidu's win is further helped by Google being banned in in China.
It helps.
Um,
It
so
helps.
so it's so that example is like Baidu was competing on being more local. That was the message, right? Like we're more local, we get
Mhm.
Chinese, and then they had these ads that Google doesn't get Chinese.
That was the interesting thing about that time and place is that here, the internet was now moving out into the country, and internet access was rising in China. This is 2010, 2011, actually a little bit before then. And to have that argument with people who are living in sort of C and D cities was very persuasive because it wasn't the most cosmopolitan part of the country. And to have a company that literally its name was Chinese versus, how do you spell Google? It became an
Mhm.
unwinnable argument for the people at Google, the issues about them being banned later
Yeah.
notwithstanding. So it's an important point. I mean, is there an argument that you can win? It doesn't have to be the most important part of your service or your offering. But if you can create those conditions where the other guy can't really win this fight, they're going to choose not to fight. They're going to choose to say, I'm going to let them have that part, and I'm going to focus where the giant is going to do what they do best. They got to be a giant for a reason. So, they've obviously done a lot of good
Mhm.
things over a long period of time. That's critically important.
Next is speed. You're quicker and more maneuverable. You take advantage. Tell me more about that.
Here's here's something. Speed was kind of when I was writing this book. Speed was what I thought would be a throwaway chapter because everyone always says, "Oh, you're smaller, you must be faster." Now, first of all, we know that isn't always true. Number one, the big learning for me in writing this chapter and going out and interviewing people who are known for creating speed cultures was that speed based cultures didn't just make decisions faster, they made them better. And the reason they're making better decisions is this cultural decision to eliminate the fat, the unnecessary parts of decision making, is baked into how they go about their days every day. This was a huge learning for me. I mean, it's intuitive now. It makes sense to me now on reflection. Um, evidence-based cultures. I had a boss early in my career, very pivotal moment for me, and I was working for a huge company. I was working for this tiny little $86 billion company at the time called Sony. But my boss was very much of the speed-based culture philosophy, and he said, "Facts, not feelings." When we come into a room, and this was mirrored by Silicon Valley software executives and others who I interviewed, excuse me, in this chapter, who would say, anytime we come together to make a decision, I want you to yell and scream and tell me that I'm wrong. And here's why. Here's the data that I have to back that up. Then we're going to make a decision. And once we make a decision, I want you to be very comfortable saying 10 minutes ago, I hated this idea, but now I see 3 ways to make it better. And as a result, it strips away all the unnecessary posturing and politics and stuff that so many of us have lived through in our careers, where, the senior most guy in the room is going to lean back at some point and give us 20 minutes of his unsupported opinion. And there are no facts on the table. So the speed-based culture thing to me was fascinating. And it's also interesting, I wrote a follow-up ebook called The Killing Giants Framework, where I interviewed a senior executive from Samsung. Now, here's a massive multi-billion-dollar company that is also known to be a speed-based culture. and their perspective was, there's no reason that a small company should be able to make decisions faster. If we have bigger moving parts and we have more gravity to bring to the marketplace, we should be able to move very quickly too. And I love that perspective. But to me, particularly in the world of software, the ability to make faster decisions, collect information faster, make decisions on that new information, and then change what's out in the marketplace is the ultimate advantage. Because as the big company is trying to compete with you, what happens is they're going to pull all their executives together, and they're going to have a competitive response team, and they're going to start analyzing a product that is now 2 generations old because you've already moved on. Isn't that the big advantage of speed? I think it is.
Yeah.
So, very counterintuitive
strategy
chapter.
number 3. Strategy number 3 you outline is win in the last 3 feet. What does that mean?
Yes. Winning in the last 3 feet had to do with it's an interesting. There's a bunch of different ways we can go in this chapter. One of my favorite examples was Adobe and what they were able to do. And this was a retail ploy, but it applies to business. It applies to almost anything. And one of the ways I can oversimplify this point is spending other people's money. How can you let your giant create a market condition where consumers are aware of a category and then jump in at that point of purchase? And if you'll forgive the sports analogy, turn a slam dunk at least into a jump ball. Can I get involved in the last minute? Can I put people in retail stores where I can capture 20, 30, 40% of the sales at the last moment because I can demo the product, because I can get in front, because I can be more personable, even though people came into a store looking for my competitor's product. The same goes in B2B. Perhaps this is nothing more complex and sophisticated than paid search. Can I jump in at that point of purchase, that point of influence at the last minute and say, have you considered us? So winning in the last 3 feet is very executional. It's very tactical. And, companies can't do it by accident. This has to be part of the planning. That has to be part of the culture that says we're going to be nimble enough to recognize when the big competitor makes a move, we should be able to be there at that moment, wherever that moment is, whether it's in a browser or in a retail store.
Strategy number 4, fight dirty. So how do you fight dirty against the Giants?
Yeah. Fighting dirty was all about changing business models. Sometimes, I think one of the examples I gave in Fighting Dirty, let me see if I remember this clearly, shifting anchor points, competing on the basis of pain tolerance. There was a wonderful example of a company. Again, this is a retail, this is a B2C example, but where the giant makes their money, very often is big flagship product. We saw this in the headset business, for example, is a business I've been involved with for many years, where a company makes a tremendous amount of money on a flagship product line, and a competitor comes in and dramatically undercuts them in price with very little pain on their part, because it's a minor part of this giant killer's business, but it's critically important to the giant. So any way that we can create that poison pill environment, again, it's called Fighting Dirty for a reason. This is a tough strategy to employ. We're breaking expectations and breaking business models here. But again, they're the giant. They're risk averse. They don't want to change. They they came into the office this morning with a to-do list, and they don't want to deviate from it. They're paid not to make mistakes. So when someone who is faster and nimbler and is working with less overhead, working with more flexibility, can come in and economically upset a market in a highly disruptive fashion, right? We see this in the software, in the SaaS market every day, where a company can come in and just say, "Hey, listen, we're going to move from capital expense to an operating expense." If we can shift that model away, then big companies have a hard time reacting to it and a hard time responding to it. So, Fighting Dirty, in short, is finding ways to use business models to break your giant's cash cow. And it's horrible if you're on the receiving end of it too. For those giants listening to this podcast, it's not fun to deal with. So,
Strategy number 5: eat the bug. What does that mean?
yeah, do the impossible. Do what the other company can't do. It's one of the business model questions that we got involved with. Eating the bug here had a lot to do with risk aversion, with really kind of confronting your giant's greatest fear. I'll give you a very topical example of this. In the apparel industry, what we see now is a lot of companies in textile and in apparel talking about sustainability. And there's a lot of talk about it, but there's very little action, because action is extremely difficult and extremely hard. And what we see now is a growing class of companies that are coming out, direct to consumer, digitally native brands, who are coming out and are built for sustainability. This becomes extremely dangerous for a brand like Patagonia, who I love. It's a wonderful brand, and they've built this great sustainable story. However, that sustainability only goes so deep because they're a big brand, and it's hard to do that across an entire product line. So if you can do what the giant finds impossible to do, I can't be sustainable across my entire product line. Factories can't supply me. There are companies who are literally saying my products in the apparel industry. There are companies that are literally saying my garments are made 100% recycled, plastic. But they're literally building new plastic bottles in order to shred them and use them and call it 100% recycled. Not exactly efficient, not exactly ethically pure. This is the problem. So very often you talk about giant killers, you talk about smaller, nimbler companies. here's a situation where we can do what the giant is absolutely unable to do. And we see this in a number of categories. Auto companies are suspect here, the apparel industry, etc. So,
Let's move on. Inconvenient truths. Implementing new pricing strategies.
pricing strategies, yeah. So, inconvenient truths very often came down to cases where we were able to use an effective pricing strategy, whether it's an emotional pricing strategy or a rational pricing strategy. So, for example, when we look at the transportation industry, one of the examples I used was JetBlue. And JetBlue is one of those companies that would have a $31 fare on Halloween. And you would see this advertised and you would say to yourself, hey, this could only come from JetBlue. This is synonymous with the way that they operate. And it may be only on this one day, but it creates this image in the mind and it creates brand loyalty over time. That being said, the entire argument of fighting against a competitor with a big brand is, can I drag this onto rational ground? Can I move away from that emotional pull and get to a point where someone is really going to do the math when typically the brand power would suck them away, right? So anytime that we can, for example, move to the cloud, move to a per user case instead of a licensed, a larger company-wide license base. Can I prove to my target that we are in fact significantly cheaper and we do just about everything that the giant does? That creates that inconvenient truth where we can wrong foot or we can disadvantage the giant and just compete on ground of our own choosing.
Right. Yeah. You can see that with like a lot of clones popping up for Intercom, which is a dominant player. People try to people copy and then just do that. Well, basically, they're commoditizing the features by offering them on the cheap. So let's remove the brand layer, and then new is the usage-based pricing. So if traditionally it was like how many seats you had or whatever, but like, do you actually use it? And so if you come in with a similar product, but you charge per actual usage, can basically disrupt the way the business is done.
Yep, exactly so.
Let's look at the next one. Number 7, polarize on purpose. Force people to make a choice. How does that work?
Forcing people to make a choice. Polarizing on purpose really this strategy began life called Aikido. And it was, can I push the market in one direction so strongly that they have to react? And I realized that was just the wrong metaphor here. Polarizing on purpose is basically taking such a polar opposite view to the giant that we are making a very strong contrast between, so the consumer has to make a choice. So, gosh, there are so many examples of this. It's hard to focus on one.
So would the choice be like based on values, or what is the choice there?
Yeah, I mean, very often it can be on values, it can be on positioning, it can be on the entire emotional branding pull of what we're trying to get done. Polarizing the market very much gets into focus, it gets into niche, it gets into the language that we use to describe what it is we're offering. So if you're a fan and a practitioner of the social science of influence and you're a Robert Cialdini adherent, if you've read his book, Influence, Science, and Practice, the contrast phenomenon here is sort of the central pillar that runs through all of the 6 principles that he goes through. And so our ability to really drive that polarization. When I was first consulting with Jabra, the headset company, the Danish company, one of their early advantages was that they were relying on a software-based infrastructure where their dominant competitor was still using dip switches. And at that time, there was a huge opportunity. This was back in 2011, so these conditions don't necessarily apply today, but it's illustrative. The ability to say, listen, we're software driven, which means that in a centralized fashion, my IT people can reset the radio strength for all of my wireless headsets with one click of a button, which in that business meant that density could be increased with wireless headsets. And all of a sudden, they could compete with a wireless product where the dominant competitor had to compete with wired tethered headsets. Now, every call center, financial trader, any telephone intensive professional in the world is going to tell you, if I have a choice, I want to be wireless. Not because I'm going to get up and walk around, but because I don't want to be, I don't want to have that hard wire between me and my terminal. That was a wonderful opportunity for us to say the world is wireless, where the other guy couldn't really say that. So being able to polarize that market in that fashion was very powerful.
Number 8 is seize the microphone. Dominate the conversation with confidence.
Seize the microphone.
Is that something
this
like
is such
Elon
an
Musk?
Interesting one because yeah, it could be Elon Musk. The example I had at the time was Bob Parsons, the founder and then CEO of GoDaddy, where the domain registry business had been around. This was not a new thing, but he was the first guy to say, register your own domain and have fun and launch your own business. And all of his established competitors said, we've been doing this for years, but no one had ever actually spoken to the market about it. I'll give you another example, and this is a few years ago, but when TomTom, the GPS company, came to the United States, they were the number one player in Europe. And they didn't really have any presence in the US. The US was dominated by Garmin and Magellan and some others. And they were fighting the typical channel-focused fight. I have these new features this year. I have these new products this year. And anyone who's really searching for the product probably knew about Garmin versus whoever else. TomTom comes to the US and launches national advertising and says, hey, would you like to have a GPS system in your car that can tell you where to go? And all the incumbents looked at this and said, well, obviously you can do that. We've been doing this in the country for 20 years. This is an established business, but no one had ever spoken to the end user about it. And sometimes a little bit of strategic naivety can pay off. So many industries that we can look around and identify are always talking to each other. They're not talking to the market. Very common in B2B, very common in industrial. So when we look at that and we say, are you communicating to your end users, or is your entire marketing spend going to your channel and to influencers who already know everything about your product? There's an opportunity to be dumb and naive, introduce yourself to your market, and all of a sudden, and they walked out of that 12 months later with a quarter of the US market. So there are rewards to be had for simply communicating with your market sometimes. In the absence of a spokesperson in a marketplace, you can be the spokesperson. That's the big lesson here. It's okay to seize the microphone and decide that you're going to be the voice of your industry, particularly when no one else is doing it. You don't have to be the biggest. You don't even have to be the best. You have to present the most persuasive vision of the future, and you will get a disproportionate amount of the business to be had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that was kind of like what Donald Trump was doing with the media, and Elon Musk, Tesla famously spending $0 on advertising, whereas his top 5 competitors spend some $20 billion a year. Just
Hmm.
speaking about a better, let's say, better vision, just as you said, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Trump is a great example of that. And I know it's not popular to talk about it today, but when he went early in his campaign, he announced that he was going to run for president, and everyone kind of chuckled. And he went down to the border and said, "This is a disaster. We need to build a wall." And all of a sudden, he went to 20% in the polling. And every other candidate said, "Oh, well, yeah, we should do that." And all of a sudden, the game was over. And it was that fast, just that ability to seize the microphone, grab a hold of that sort of industry spokesmanship, in that case, political spokesmanship. And it's an excellent example. So, yes, Elon Musk as well. People hang on his words, occasionally for better or for worse. But you want to talk about a car industry executive. Can you name a second one? There's Elon Musk. Who
Only
who
Carlos
else?
Ghosn, who
Who
was
is the
like
big voice piece?
escaped.
Yeah, okay. You can't find him these days, but I think he's hiding somewhere. But there isn't anybody. There is no household name in the auto
No.
industry except for that one guy. So he's been very successful at sucking all the oxygen out of the room.
Strategy number 9: all the wood behind the arrows. Resoundingly win in a few key
Arrows.
areas.
This is an interesting one because again, the example here, that chapter began life as all the wood behind the arrow, singular. And the more people I spoke to, and these were some brilliant people, Eric Ryan, who was the then co-founder of Method, the detergent brand, you know, began life as this, hey, let's do something green and sustainable. Let's make clean. How do we make detergent clean? We had no idea detergent was so dirty, chemical laden, pollutant, and all of this, all of these negatives behind cleaning products. So they begin life from a chemist's perspective, creating green, sustainable, good for your skin, safe for your family. But at the same time, they brought in a second sensibility, which was design. What if we took a design cue from the fragrance category? You look at a bottle of cologne. These are not industrial looking bottles sitting on the counter. These are beautifully designed. What if you could design a detergent brand that was meant to be seen? And the whole point behind Method, and this was the real key, was being able to say we're not just about one thing. We're about a few things. And it's the nuance and it's the complexity behind the interplay here. Method says we're green and sustainable. We're also aesthetically very beautiful. 42 Below Vodka, one of my favorite stories from New Zealand, vodka from New Zealand, of course, go figure. And he talked about, in his case, this was Jeff Ross at the time, this very pure product, that was designed to win awards in tasting competition and everything else. They just spent a lot on fairly small batch, very high quality, but this very irreverent, funny, tongue-in-cheek, occasionally offensive advertising that separated them from all of this kind of clean, serious Nordic kind of imagery behind vodka. And his quote to me was, brands are like people. We like to be around people who are many things, who are complicated, who don't necessarily take themselves too seriously. But there's a lot going on here. If it's one dimensional, it's boring. I asked Eric Ryan at Method. I said, could Unilever, could Procter and Gamble, could they copy you? And he said, no, they would have made a different shaped red bottle, referring to Tide detergent. He said, if we were one dimensional, the giants would have killed us long ago. They would have copied us, they would have killed us. And I thought that was an absolutely counterintuitive insight, because so often in this sort of marketing community, in the thought leader community, the author community, there's so much attention paid to, oh, you have to be about one thing and you have to be really good at that one thing. Well, not, yes, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're truly one dimensional, you can be copied either from above, from the giant, or from below, from the next one to disrupt you. You have to be unique. And uniqueness doesn't always flow from, I have a feature. You have to be nuanced. You have to be interesting. You have to be sufficiently complex to gain people's attention and interest. So thus, all the wood behind the arrows. There's more than one arrow. There has to be.
And finally, number 10, show your teeth. Pursue your competitive advantage vigorously.
Yeah, show your teeth was all about not being shy. When you have an advantage over a giant, you need to make them uncomfortable. You need to be able to be willing to fight. And this is the key. The giant never wants to fight. They want to win by default. They want to be the choice of the market, because when a giant killer brand emerges and has a distinct competitive advantage, they want it to go away. So here, that ability of a smaller company that says, listen, we are demonstrably better. I was at iOmega once upon a time, a long, long time ago, back in the late 90s. And the zip drive, of course, was this dominant format in that time period, 100 megabyte removable storage. And we had an emergent competitor there who was not only bigger in storage, but cheaper. Media was cheap. The drive was cheap. And it was very difficult. We didn't want to get into the conversation because we were the giant at that time. So, the ability to sort of, from the giant's perspective, kind of stay aloof and just say, well, we don't have to necessarily compete with everyone because we don't want to. That's not on our agenda today. We're risk averse. We're trying to get big things done. And up comes a giant killer that is irritating us because we know they're better. So here we are in this age of direct to consumer, and we see this all the time. And the ability of a brand to come out and say, listen, big brands make decisions based on scale more often than not. They're driven by cost accounting. They're driven by a fairly mass market worldview. And for a small, nimble player, a giant killer to emerge that says, we have no overhead whatsoever. We do not have a glass atrium lobby in Seattle or New York. We don't have to pay for all of that. We can design a product, we can design a service that cuts no corners, that makes no compromises at all. The giant can't afford to do this. Therefore, we should be willing and happy and excited about shouting that message to the rooftops, because it's very difficult to counter when you're a giant. So it was interesting. We just went through the 10 chapters of the book, and I must admit, it's been a long time since I've looked at some of them. What's interesting to me, when I started to speak about this body of research, this was 88 interviews, a dozen countries, and getting up in the middle of the night and meeting entrepreneurs from the townships of South Africa or Brazil or Germany or wherever I was reaching people. When I began to speak about this, I saw this break down into three really big ideas, three big movements. When we look at thin ice, when we look at things like that, I said, this is about seizing the narrative. Very much a marketing story. How can I seize the narrative in the marketplace and basically shift the focus, shift everyone's focus to a place that I want to talk about? And that was very powerful. The second was really what I referred to as change the rules of the game. Very much a business model question. Software as a service is an entire industry that has grown up around cracking industry norms. Direct to consumer, again, how can I change the rules of the game, change the economics, change distribution, change logistics, whatever it happens to be? And the third one I called translating ideas into action. Very cultural, speed based cultures, changing the culture so that we're in a position to do things that others are simply not structured culturally to respond to. Seize the narrative, change the rules, translate ideas into action. And I found over time, when I was doing keynotes and things like that around this body of research, that the chapters sort of neatly fell into these three buckets. And it resonates today. I mean, I wrote this book in 2011. I gave a speech in late 2000, still talking about these concepts. And I wrote it to be somewhat timeless. I reached back and got some old, case studies because they matter. And there are certain timeless bits of wisdom that I can gather from people who have done really interesting things over time. And we can have this conversation today about software as a service, about cloud, about AI, Internet of Things, and all of these things still resonate. All of these ideas, these 10 strategies, still matter regardless of which industry that we're pointing them towards. So, from that perspective, I'm very pleased. It seems to have, held on to its value well over time.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Hey, my pleasure.